everyone. So I hope everybody had a great spring break and that you guys are all ready to get back into it and start discussing the topic for this week, which is the New Deal. So last time, when we last left off, we were talking about how the United States had fallen into the Great Depression. So today we're going to be looking at how the United States attempted to deal with the problems created by the Great Depression and to a large extent reorganize and restructure the way we manage the American economy. And that was really what the New Deal was all about. So there are kind of two major questions that we'll be talking about today for the New Deal. The two big questions are, first of all, how did the New Deal link the idea of freedom to the expanding power of the federal government? And then how radical was the New Deal and what were the New Deal's limitations? So we'll be kind of focusing on those two big questions for today. So to start us off talking about the New Deal, we really have to know a little bit about the man who was behind the New Deal, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the nation's choice to replace Herbert Hoover as president in 1932. He was born on January 30th, 1882, in upstate New York, and both his parents were from wealthy old New York families, and he was their only child. And he grew up in an atmosphere of privilege. So he was, part of that old money New York family. He was, sort of very wealthy and privileged. While he was in college, his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, became president. And he was kind of a role model for FDR. His kind of vigorous leadership style and his reforming kind of ethos, his kind of progressive ideals, made him the hero to the young Franklin. And Franklin entered Columbia Law School in 1905, but he dropped out. He never actually ended up graduating because he had already passed the New York State bar exam. And so he very briefly went to work at a corporate law firm on Wall Street. But he quickly kind of got into politics, and in 1910 he ran for the New York State Senate, and he won, and he became a leader of a group of reformers there, progressives, who opposed the kind of Tammany Hall machine that dominated the state Democratic Party. So he was involved in efforts to try to clean up and get the corruption out of state politics. He was appointed the Assistant Secretary of the Navy by Woodrow Wilson in 1913. So while World War I was going on, Roosevelt was working in the Defense Department. In August 1921, while the Roosevelts were vacationing, FDR contracted an illness. And at the time, it was believed to be polio, which resulted in his total and permanent paralysis from the waist down. And so this was... you have to kind of remember a time when the private lives of public figures were not subject to the same kind of scrutiny that they are today. And so he was able to convince a lot of people that he was in fact getting better. And he believed that was really essential for his future political career. He didn't believe that he could be a successful politician if he was seen as disabled in any way. So he basically taught himself to walk a short distance. He had braces on his legs and his hips, and he was able to kind of teach himself how to walk a little bit while supporting himself with a cane. In private, he always used a wheelchair. So you very rarely will see any photographs of FDR in a wheelchair, but you'll very often see photographs of him sitting down and occasionally standing behind a podium. But yes, he was disabled. And he was very careful never to allow that to be seen in public, though. He usually appeared in public standing upright. He was either supported by one of his sons or by an aide or standing behind some kind of podium. And so he resumed his political career. He was elected governor of New York in 1928, and he came to office as a Reform Democrat. And as governor, he established a number of new social programs, and he began kind of gathering a team of advisors that he would bring with him to Washington 4 years later. So he was elected right before the Great Depression hit. And he was a very talented and persuasive politician. He was very good at convincing people of his convictions. He was very charismatic. He just projected a lot of confidence and optimism, and he was very, very skilled and effective at using the media. He was a very popular governor, and he had this very strong base in the nation's most populous state at the time, New York, and that made him kind of an obvious candidate for the Democratic nomination in 1928, in 1932, because it was going to be hotly contested. It seemed like the incumbent, Herbert Hoover, would be very vulnerable in the 1932 election. So in 1932, he ran for president, and he was able to create a coalition that would later become known as the New Deal Coalition. The Roosevelt and the Democratic Party were able to mobilize not only poor people, of which there were a lot more in 1932 because of the Depression. They were able to get on their side labor, ethnic minorities, people who lived in the cities, and also Southern whites, who were the kind of traditional base for the Democratic Party. And he was able to kind of put this coalition together. During the campaign, FDR said, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. And that's where that phrase New Deal came from. This was later adopted for his whole comprehensive legislative program, and it was also the name given to his political coalition as well. So in 1932, the election was not even close, as you can see from this electoral map here. Roosevelt won with 57% of the popular vote, almost 58%, and he carried all but 6 states. So you can see it was basically a landslide in 1932. Hoover had 0 chance. So when Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933, the U.S. was on the brink of something pretty disastrous. It was really the bottom point of the worst depression in American history. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Now today we have about 3 to 4% unemployment. So just imagine if 25% of the country were unemployed. Farmers were in deep trouble. Prices had fallen by 60%. Industrial production had fallen by more than half since 1929. 2 million people were homeless. And by the evening of his inauguration, 32 out of 48 states at the time, as well as the District of Columbia, had closed their banks. Banks across the country were shut down. The New York Federal Reserve branch was unable to open the following morning, the morning of FDR's inauguration, because panicked customers, whom you can see here on the left, they had withdrawn all of their funds. They tried to get all of their money out of the bank in previous days because people just had 0 confidence that their money was actually going to be safe in a bank. So this was a real crisis. And beginning with his inauguration address, Roosevelt begins blaming the economic crisis on bankers and financiers, on the quest for profit, and on this unregulated, self-interested capitalism that had driven the economy of the 1920s. And in his inaugural address, which is a very famous document, which you can read in chapter 25 of For the Record, you can see he kind of projects this natural air of confidence and optimism. And this was kind of the backdrop for his famous words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." What he's trying to do here is to stop the American people from panicking, basically, to stop the crisis from getting any worse, because a large part of the Great Depression, the reason why it became so severe was that people just were panicking. It was creating this kind of downward spiral, and that needed to kind of stop. So the very next day after he was inaugurated, FDR declared a bank holiday. He said, we are going to close all of the banks all over the country, and we're going to allow them to reopen on a kind of regulated basis. So he drafted new banking legislation that provided for government supervision and aid to the banks. Strong banks would be reopened. They would be backed by the federal government. Weak banks were going to be closed. Those who were in difficulty would receive loans and kind of subsidies, bailouts from the government. They also passed a piece of legislation known as the Glass-Steagall Act. This was a really important piece of legislation because it prevented banks from buying and selling stocks. And until this act was repealed in the 1990s, it basically prevented many of the irresponsible practices that had led to the stock market crash in the first place. They also established, the FDR administration also established the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is basically a government system that insures your bank account. So whenever you go into a bank, or usually when you see commercials for banks on television, it'll say member FDIC on it. Or you'll see a sticker on the door that says member of FDIC, which basically means that the federal government is insuring the money that's in that bank. So it's kind of a confidence measure to let people know that, the government is behind this bank, and, if anything happens, the government will, sort of secure the money that's held in this bank. They also took the U.S. off the gold standard to be able to issue more money to stimulate the economy. Now, so the New Deal, this was what was kind of done immediately with the kind of immediate efforts to restore and to provide relief for the American economy. And historians have kind of categorized Roosevelt's overall program as relief, recovery, and reform. Of course, relief is urgently needed for the tens of millions of people who are unemployed, who are destitute, who are starving. Recovery meant boosting the economy back to normal, getting things back on track. And then reform meant long-term fixes of what was wrong, especially with the financial and banking systems. And much of what would later be called the New Deal was implemented in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency. And that really concentrated on the first part of his strategy, immediate relief. From March 9th to June 16th, 1933, FDR sent Congress a record number of bills, and Congress just passed all of them very easily. FDR really saw the Depression as a matter of confidence. It had been exacerbated in part because people were no longer spending and investing because they were afraid to do so. So he set out to restore confidence, to restore the confidence of the American people through a series of dramatic gestures. Now, at the time, the proposals that FDR put in place seemed to be pretty radical. It was really the first time the federal government had done anything on this kind of a scale. But it's actually remarkable, looking back at it, how conservative Roosevelt's plan was. For example, he could have come in and said, nope, we're nationalizing all the banks. We are just going to take over the American banking system. But he didn't do that. He instead threw the government's resources behind them. He allowed them to remain private, but they needed to be regulated. And so he was really out to reform and restore the American economic system, not to change it drastically. Now, I'm not going to concentrate too much on all of the individual pieces of the New Deal, and you can read about the agencies and the programs that FDR's administration established in your textbook. And it gets really, really tedious when you have to try to remember all of those acronyms. Sometimes it's called, sort of the New Deal alphabet soup, because you have to remember, the NRA, the AAA, the TVA. We're going to talk about some of those agencies because some of them are pretty important. But what you should remember, kind of the big picture here, is that FDR does not come into office with a comprehensive plan. The New Deal was really an experiment. FDR and his advisors were kind of throwing whatever they could at the problem and seeing what worked and what didn't. And some of the programs and agencies worked, and some not so much. Some of these agencies would be dissolved or declared unconstitutional. Some would be reorganized later. But the important thing, at least initially, was that FDR was doing something. And this really helped to boost people's confidence. It was a massive expansion of the role of the federal government. And that was really the kind of big thing, big takeaway about the New Deal, is that it represents a huge shift in what we believe the federal government can do, especially when it comes to regulating the American economy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is known as the first New Deal. So the programs implemented between 1933 and 1935 are often called by historians the first New Deal. And these programs really concentrated on emergency measures and immediate relief programs. These did not bring the U.S. out of the Depression, but it did help to boost America's spirits and help to kind of give people a sense of confidence that, something was being done. And that helps to kind of, boost the economy in the long term. So 2 of the major programs that were launched during the first 100 days were aimed at the industrial sector of the economy and the agricultural sector. The first of these was the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. Now, we think of today as the NRA as being the National Rifle Association. For the purposes of the New Deal, it means the National Recovery Administration. The NRA was an attempt to achieve economic progress through planning and cooperating between government, business, and labor. It was basically an aim to get government and business and labor all on the same page, all working together. And they hoped to kind of achieve the goals of both business owners, people who, were the heads of corporations, the employers, and labor, the employees, by creating business codes that would set limits on production, that would set guidelines for prices, that would mandate protections for labor, things like maximum hours, minimum wage, that would guarantee people's right to collectively bargain. And they sought to appeal to people's patriotism to induce companies to join. And you can really see that in this cartoon here. You've got Uncle Sam, and you've got the employee and the employer. They're all kind of working together. They're all proudly sporting this symbol of the NRA, which was known as the Blue Eagle. And you can't see that it's blue here, but it was blue. And by the summer of 1933, more than 500 industries had joined. They had adopted these codes, and about 2.5 million workers were covered under the NRA. The NRA did not work as well as people might have hoped it would. It was very quickly bogged down in a lot of bureaucracy. These codes were very hard to enforce. They ended up favoring big business at the expense of their smaller competitors. Labor unions were not very happy either because the minimum wages that were set under the NRA were pretty much at starvation level. And businesses were able to avoid having to collectively bargain by creating company unions. So it was not a terribly successful program, and the Supreme Court finally actually invalidates the NRA in 1935. They declare it to be an unconstitutional exercise of presidential power. Now, the other kind of big part of the first New Deal was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And again, we think of the AAA today as being an insurance company. Back in the New Deal era, it was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. So this was designed to tackle the really severe problems in the agricultural sector of the economy. When Roosevelt took office, the most severe element of the American economy was really agriculture, and it had been depressed for a lot longer than just the years of the Great Depression. And this was due to a lot of different factors. There was increasing mechanization in American agriculture. Demand for agricultural products was actually decreasing. And so whenever a farmer gave up his horse or mule and bought a tractor, he not only could plow more acreage, but he had more acreage to plow. And in the 1920s, an estimated 25 to 35 million acres of land were put into cultivation simply because they were no longer needed to feed horses and mules, livestock. And so the result of all this increased production and decreased demand was lower prices. Now, for the consumer, obviously lower prices are great, but for the producer, for the farmer, lower prices mean disaster. And disaster for farmers usually took the form of foreclosures or, having to sell off your equipment. So the Depression really brings the farmers' difficulties to a climax because it cuts off their most important market. So Roosevelt put into place the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. So this was designed to basically tackle this very immediate and dangerous crisis that was going on in 1933. And this was a crisis of, overproduction and falling prices. And the AAA acted to boost farm prices for 7 major commodities: wheat, cotton, corn, pigs, tobacco, rice, and milk. And they had to adopt some pretty severe measures to do this. For a couple of these commodities, the agency had been created so late in the growing season that the crops were already planted. The livestock had already been born. And so cotton, for example, was selling at a nickel a pound because of the previous year's surplus. And the cotton crop for the year had already been planted. And if it was harvested later in the year, that price would go even lower. So this was a really severe problem. So the Agricultural Adjustment Administration basically paid farmers to plow under their plants. And they were able to take, sort of a huge amount of land out of cultivation and able to kind of stabilize the falling prices of cotton. They also did the same thing with hog production, pigs. And this actually became very controversial because a lot of the corn harvested in the United States is consumed by pigs. And the price of pork then determines the price of corn. So when the AAA went into operation, it was already well into the season for growing or, cultivating pigs. And in order to limit production, the AAA basically paid farmers to kill piglets. And, this was very controversial because, this is seen as the government just slaughtering all these innocent animals. And the other kind of, flip side of that was that, they actually did give 100 million pounds of pork to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to be distributed free of charge to poor people. So they ended up actually stabilizing the crop prices. Crop prices rose about 55% in the first 6 months after the AAA was created. But by 1936, the Supreme Court had said, nope, this was an unconstitutional use of executive power, and so it was, sort of declared unconstitutional. But by then, the farm emergency was kind of over. So they were able to, kind of get rid of these temporary crop reductions without, too much problem. But again, it was declared unconstitutional. Another program of the first 100 days that was a little bit more successful was the Tennessee Valley Authority. And Roosevelt signed the act creating the TVA on May 18th, 1933, and it actually is still in existence today. Even by Depression-era standards, the Tennessee Valley, which you can see there on the left on the map, was really in sad shape in 1933. 30% of the population in this area of the country was affected by malaria. And the average income in this area was only $639 per year, with some families surviving on as little as $100 per year. So it's a very impoverished area. A lot of the land in this area had been farmed very, sort of significantly for too long. And so the soil had been eroded and depleted. Crop yields had fallen along with farmers' incomes. And lumber was another big industry in this area, but the best lumber had already been cut. And 10% of, sort of the forests in this region were being burnt every year. So the TVA was a program designed to modernize this region of the country, basically using experts and electricity to combat these really severe problems of poverty and kind of, social backwardness, basically, modernization. So the TVA did things, essentially what they did was create a series of dams along the Tennessee River that would bring power to this region of the country. They also worked with farmers. They developed fertilizers. They taught farmers ways to improve their crop yields and help replant forests. They tried to control some of the forest fires that were problematic in this region. They improved the habitat for fish and wildlife. And electricity was, sort of a major component of it. Electric lights and modern appliances made life easier. It made farms more productive. It also drew industry into the region, which provided some really desperately needed jobs for people. Now, none of this was easy. The development of these dams along the Tennessee River ended up displacing about 15,000 families. And naturally, this caused a lot of resentment among some rural communities. And a lot of, the local people in the area were already kind of suspicious of the government to begin with. But the TVA really was pretty successful at introducing these new agricultural methods into these traditional farming communities. And so they basically worked with leaders of the local communities and, helped them convince the farmers that, crop rotation is a good thing. And if you put fertilizer on your crops, it's going to restore the fertility of the soil. And so this was something to really kind of, modernize this region of the country that was severely economically depressed. And the TVA was just one example of, they did this all around the country in some areas that were, experiencing severe hardship. So the TVA is kind of one example of that. The New Deal was also pretty successful at providing economic relief for millions of unemployed and destitute Americans. In 1933, Roosevelt brought in a guy named Harry Hopkins to run the Reconstruction Finance Corporation's relief program. Remember, the RFC was something that had been put in place by the Hoover administration, and FDR continued it. And so Hopkins went straight to work, and he famously spent more than $5 million in less than 2 hours. And so he was really willing to give out the kind of relief to the American people that Hoover had not been. So by the end of 1933, they had distributed money to nearly 1/6 of the American people. This allowed people to avoid starvation, to stay out of the breadlines. One of the most popular programs of the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps, with the CCC, which you can see a picture of there on the upper left. This was an example of a jobs program. It basically enrolled young men between, I think, 18 and 25 and sent them to work on the nation's public lands, doing things like cutting trails, building bridges, planting trees, paving roads. More than 2 million people served in the CCC, and it was a really great option for all of these young men who were, unemployed and couldn't find jobs elsewhere. Harry Hopkins argued that the government should be putting the unemployed people in America to work, not just to encourage their self-respect, but to enable them to earn enough money to buy consumer goods. And this would end up stimulating the entire economy. So one of the kind of most comprehensive New Deal agencies designed to do this was the Works Progress Administration. The WPA employed millions of people, and it affected almost every place all around the country. It was created in 1935, and it provided jobs and income to the unemployed during the Great Depression. And the WPA built public buildings, it built roads, it also operated large arts programs, theater, literacy projects. It did all kinds of things. It fed children, it redistributed food, clothing, and housing, and it was basically the largest, up until it was shut down by Congress in 1943, it was the largest employment base in the entire country. And anyone who needed a job could become eligible for most of its jobs. And about 75% of WPA employment were in things like public facilities and infrastructure, building highways, creating public buildings, airports, dams, city halls, public libraries. The WPA built 650,000 miles of roads, 78,000 bridges, 125,000 buildings, 700 miles of airport runways. They also allocated some portion of the budget to arts programs. Concerts were presented to audiences. 150 million Americans saw concerts through the WPA. 475,000 pieces of art, public art, were created during the WPA. So not just, blue-collar workers, but also artists, musicians, actors, writers were employed with the WPA. And it really was, it was such a comprehensive program. It did not really end up overcoming the Depression, though. And it was never sufficiently funded in order that it would be able to do that. It never employed more than 3 million of the 10 million Americans who were out of work. And the wages that were paid by WPA jobs were pretty low, so it didn't end up kind of having that effect of priming the economy by increasing consumer purchasing power. But it was a start. And so it, really was an attempt to, kind of put people back to work, and also an attempt to kind of improve the culture of Americans. Allow a huge number of Americans who might never otherwise get to see a play or hear a concert or see a piece of art by, a famous artist, got to do this through the WPA. But as I said, the New Deal was not having the impact that it, sort of might have had in order to kind of bring the U.S. to get frustrated. And there were a number of kind of alternatives that were challenging the conservative nature of the New Deal, and that really force the administration to move a little bit even further along the spectrum of the political spectrum to the left. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what becomes known as the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal is, sort of the shift towards creating permanent economic reform. And Roosevelt was facing a lot of challenges in this period, in kind of right around 1934, 1935, from other people who had kind of different ideas about how to deal with the Depression. So there was a lot of discontent in the country still present in 1935. And we see a number of kind of popular figures who capture the nation's imagination and who kind of challenge Roosevelt in his approach to fixing the problems of the Depression. The first of these was a guy named Father Charles Coughlin. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he had a regular radio program in which he would give weekly sermons. And so he actually ended up creating his own national network, and he had millions of followers. He was very famously, he preached about kind of the negative influence of Wall Street and international bankers on kind of the economy. And he believed in the need to kind of reform the monetary system, including eliminating the Federal Reserve System. And he began denouncing Roosevelt. Initially, he was in favor of what Roosevelt did, but he began denouncing Roosevelt as just being a tool of Wall Street. And he became a very bitter opponent of the New Deal. And as he, sort of grew in his popularity, he also, sort of became more and more strident in his kind of, attacks on Roosevelt and capitalists. He also ended up being pretty anti-Semitic. And he accused Roosevelt of leaning towards international socialism. He founded an organization called the National Union for Social Justice. And a lot of people were, this was a very popular organization. And he had an audience of about 30 million Americans listening to his ideas. So he kind of represented a real challenge to FDR's vision for what he wanted to do with the country. Another kind of figure challenging Roosevelt's leadership was a guy named Dr. Francis Townsend. Dr. Townsend was a physician who proposed a rather novel idea to help elderly Americans during the Depression. What he basically did was he called for a guaranteed monthly pension of $200, which in the 1930s was quite a considerable sum. It would have enabled its recipients to live a pretty middle-class lifestyle. And so every retired citizen age 65 or older would get this monthly pension. It was to be paid for by a national sales tax of 2% on all business transactions. And these kind of the catch here, the stipulation was that everybody who received this pension would be required to spend the money within 30 days. So the idea was to end the Depression through consumer spending by way of ending poverty among the elderly. And obviously this was very popular among the elderly. They embraced it, kind of enthusiastically. And so people formed towns and clubs all across the country. More than 10 million people signed petitions endorsing the Townsend Plan. And I'll be talking a little bit in a minute about how, partly in kind of response to this idea, FDR ends up proposing his own policy. And we'll be, we'll be talking a little bit about that in a minute. Finally, there was Huey Long. And Huey Long was a very flamboyant senator from Louisiana. And he made very fiery speeches during the early years of the Depression, denouncing the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, sort of very powerful individuals. He criticized both parties for failing to adequately address the crisis. And so he opposed FDR's New Deal from the left. He considered it inadequate in the face of this economic crisis. And so he he was opposed to what he called the conservatism of the New Deal. He proposed basically federal legislation that would put a cap on people's personal fortunes and income and inheritances. And so he unveils this program known as Share Our Wealth. He argued that there's enough wealth in the country for every individual to enjoy a comfortable standard of living, but that it's unfairly concentrated in the hands of a few millionaire bankers, businessmen, and industrialists. So Long proposed this new tax code that would limit people's personal fortunes to $5 million. It would limit annual income to $1 million. And it would limit people's inheritances to also $5 million. The resulting funds that would be received would be used to guarantee every family in the country a basic household grant of $5,000 and a minimum annual income of $2,000 to $3,000. He also called for things like free education. He called for old age pensions. He called for veterans benefits, public work projects. He called for limiting the work week to 30 hours. He formed a national political organization called the Share Our Wealth Society. And by 1935, this organization had 7.5 million members in it. And so the pressure that FDR was feeling from some of these challenges is considered by some historians to be responsible for how FDR kind of shifts a little bit to the left in 1935 when he enacts what is known as the Second New Deal. So perhaps because of this opposition, in 1935, FDR is now ready to support a series of reform measures that are designed not only to alleviate the suffering of the Depression, but to reform the economy so the Depression can never happen again. And Roosevelt's in a good position to get these measures passed. They have a very strong Democratic majority in Congress. Many Congress people at the time were, favoring more spending, more sweeping federal programs. So the most significant reform of 1935, and probably of the entire New Deal, was the Social Security Act. And this had three major parts. It provided for elderly pensions that would be financed equally by a tax on both employers and workers. No government contributions in there. And it gave states matching funds to provide their own pensions for elderly people. It also set up a system of unemployment compensation on a federal and state basis. And it included direct federal grants to states for giving welfare payments to the blind, to the handicapped, to very needy elderly people, and also dependent children. Now, Social Security was something that got a lot of criticism at the time. Conservatives, of course, they said, oh, no, this is terrible. This is going to mean that, we are abandoning kind of traditional American ideals of self-help and individualism and, kind of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps. Those on the left argued that this proposal didn't go far enough. They argued that the pensions were too small and that not everyone was covered. Farmers, for example, and domestic servants were not included, at least initially, in Social Security. everyone, regardless of your income or your economic status, would pay in at the same rate. There was no kind of supplement that you could provide, or there was no, sort of ability to, kind of scale the amount that you would pay into it. It sort of did not really offer help to those who were already out of work, only to those who would lose their jobs in the future. And the kind of benefits that were given to the handicapped and to dependent children were pretty small in comparison to the actual need. Now, Roosevelt was a pragmatist. He knew that passing anything that more sweeping was going to be very difficult. And actually, FDR considered at the time including things like a national health insurance program to be included in Social Security, but he knew that he would not be able to get that passed through Congress. And he realized that establishing this system of federal welfare went against some very deeply rooted American beliefs in self-reliance and individualism. That's one of the reasons why he insisted that people are paying for their pensions and Social Security. You are paying into this system. By working throughout your life, you're paying a certain amount of money, and then you will get that money back when you retire. He wanted to give people kind of a vested interest. He wanted people to feel as though they'd earned their pensions. And one of the things that was most successful about Social Security is that it established a pattern. It said that the federal government has a responsibility to provide for people in our society who cannot provide for themselves, for the elderly, for dependent children, for the disabled, for the unemployed. So it sets up this pattern, and that's really kind of the thing that's most significant about Social Security. It establishes the responsibility of the federal government to provide this safety net for people, to establish kind of a baseline below which we are not going to allow people to fall underneath. And that's kind of what is most significant about it. The other kind of really revolutionary aspect of the Second New Deal was labor legislation, particularly the Wagner Act, created in 1935. This created the National Labor Relations Board, which would preside over the relationship between labor and management. And it basically, through the support of the federal government behind unions, it enabled unions to engage in collective bargaining with the support of the federal government. It also did things like outlawed tactics that were used to bust up unions. It declared that when a majority of workers voted for a union to represent them, that the company then had to negotiate with the union. And so this was a big boost to labor unions. It enabled labor unions to recruit large numbers of unorganized workers throughout the country. And you can see that in this flyer here on the left. This is kind of urging people who are working at the Ford Motor Company to organize. It says, the Wagner bill is behind you, now get behind yourselves. At the time the Congress passed the Wagner Act, the nation had just gone through a number of tumultuous strikes all across the country. And this act was really passed as an effort to kind of divert those really violent conflicts into more manageable channels, to try to kind of take the pressure off and grant workers the legal right to form unions and to bargain collectively. And it did a number of kind of important things. It legalized the right to strike. It barred employers from firing workers for engaging in union activities. It basically subjected the decisions of management to scrutiny from the federal government. It said that the federal government, sort of had a role to play in managing the relationship between unions and employers. In the first few years of the Wagner Act, many employers simply refused to recognize it as a law. And this was partly because the Supreme Court had already struck down a number of statutes passed during the New Deal. And so many companies just simply said, well, we're just going to wait for the Supreme Court to decide. And a lot of unions didn't even bother to use the National Labor Relations Board in the first few years of the practice, and they chose instead to strike for recognition. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how they used methods like the sit-down strike in just a minute. It's not until the Supreme Court upholds the constitutionality of the Wagner Act in 1937 that it becomes kind of law in practical terms as well. In 1938, Congress passes a second law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and this aimed to establish both maximum hours and minimum wages. And this was really aimed at unorganized workers. And, it was able to kind of, set up a system where you had the federal government's support behind kind of labor legislation and behind labor unions. And so what we see from this is just a huge kind of increase in the influence of labor unions around the country. Throughout most of the 1920s and at the onset of the New Deal, labor unions were in a very weak position. They had less than 3 million members. Most of them were in the American Federation of Labor, which was an organization that only unionized skilled workers. Basic and really huge industries like the steel and the automobile industry were not organized. They were not unionized. Most unskilled workers were working still in very poor wages and working conditions. And what we see with the Wagner Act and then the Fair Labor Standards Act, it's kind of putting the power of the federal government behind these unions. And we see an enormous growth in unionization. And part of this is reflected in the establishment of the Committee on Industrial Organization. Their name was later changed to the Congress of Industrial Organization. This was a new union that was founded by John L. Lewis. He was the head of the United Mine Workers. And he said he was going to use the Wagner Act to extend collective bargaining to the auto and the steel industries. And so he's able to do this. He's able to unionize the steel industry by 1937. And by the end of the 1930s, the CIO had 5 million members. And for the first time, we have unskilled as well as skilled workers unionized on kind of a massive scale. And women and African Americans really benefited from the creation of the CIO. Despite these impressive gains in the labor industry, only 28% of all Americans, excluding farm workers, belonged to unions by 1940. And there were millions of people in the restaurant industries, in retail, in service industries who still remained unorganized. So labor was making a lot of gains, but there was a long way to go. One of the ways that labor made gains in the 1930s was through a new tactic. And this was revolutionized in 1936 and 1937 with the FLINT sit-down strike. This was something that really kind of changed the United Automobile Workers from a kind of minor union on the fringes of the industry into this major organization, and it led to the unionization of the United States automobile industry. So what they did was the union, sort of basically wanted to organize the automobile industry by going after the very biggest and most powerful employer, General Motors, and focusing on GM's production complex in Flint, Michigan. Now, this was going to be very dangerous and very difficult because General Motors controlled city politics in Flint, and it kept a very close eye on outsiders. And there was also spies throughout the plants that would, kind of report back to management about any kind of union activity. Now, what happens in a conventional strike is that the union takes its members outside the factory, outside the plant, and attempts to prevent the employer from operating by discouraging other employees from entering. What they did with the Flint sit-down strike, basically the workers physically occupied the plant, keeping management and others out. So this is essentially what they did. They decided to just sit down and stop working and basically take over the factory. And they did just that. They elected their own mayor. They maintained the plant throughout the strike. They kept up a regular supply of food to the strikers inside. You had, people sympathetic to the union marching in support outside. Now, what happened in Flint was that a state court judge issued an injunction order ordering the strikers to leave the plant. And the UAW, when they investigated this, they discovered that the judge had a really significant conflict of interest. He held about $200,000 in GM stock, which basically disqualified him from hearing any case involving GM. Then the police were sent in. They attempted to enter the plant. The strikers inside the plant turned fire hoses on the police. They, sort of threw auto parts at them. And the police, sort of used tear gas against the workers inside the building. They tried to get in. The police tried to get in. But after about 6 hours, they withdrew. Basically, as the strike spread to other parts of the GM plant, GM was forced to bargain with the union. And John L. Lewis, who was the founder and the leader of the CIO, he spoke for the UAW in these negotiations. And essentially, the parties finally reached an agreement in February of 1937. The UAW was recognized as the union for GM's employees. And it gives the UAW kind of instant legitimacy. They were able to capitalize on this opportunity. They signed up 100,000 GM employees, and they, built on the strength of the union throughout the country. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about kind of the limitations of the New Deal and how radical was the New Deal really? What were some of its kind of limitations? We've already talked about kind of some of its achievements. What were some of its limitations? So even though FDR had passed Social Security in 1935, this legislation did not cover some of the nation's poorest individuals, farmers, domestic laborers. These were people who the Depression had hit really hard because economic collapse had combined with an environmental disaster. Farmers in the middle of the country were facing drought on an unprecedented scale because mechanized agriculture had turned the topsoil into sand and had killed grasses that prevented erosion. And then when you combine this with the strong winds that kind of blow across the plains, this meant huge dust storms like the one you can see here in this photo on the left. Literally, houses, whole towns are buried under dust. More than 1 million farmers are displaced by the Dust Bowl between 1935 and 1940. Now, the AAA had been pretty successful in raising farm prices and incomes, but it wasn't successful for everybody. Large landowners were the ones who mostly benefited from it. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers, they did not reap the benefits of the New Deal. And this policy of encouraging landowners not to grow crops meant that thousands of people ended up being evicted under the AAA. And combined with the Dust Bowl, this meant that some of the nation's poorest citizens were actually made worse off, not better off, by the New Deal. So the poorest Americans really didn't, benefit all that much from FDR's policies. There was also very little significant gains in the status of women. There wasn't a lot of concern with the, extending the rights of women in the midst of a, such a severe economic depression. Employers discriminated against women in favor of men when they were, firing people. Working women were accused of taking jobs that might otherwise be done by unemployed men. And federal regulations actually ended up prohibiting more than one member of a family from working in civil service. And this was, sort of in line with popular opinion at the time. 82% of Americans disapproved of married women working in the 1930s. So a lot of the women who were working were single. They might be, the sole supporter of their family. They might be a single parent. Women's wages remained lower than that of men. Their unemployment rate was higher. The codes that the NRA established actually sanctioned lower wages for women. And a lot of women were basically working in industries that weren't covered by the Labor Reform Acts. Things like domestic service. Women weren't covered under Social Security. Despite that, the number of married women and women between 25 and 40 working actually ends up increasing during the 1930s. Most of these women ended up becoming employed in the clerical sector. They were in kind of service industries. One area that you did see some advances came in government. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was famously, kind of set this example for activism for millions of American women. She was a very active First Lady. She was extremely popular, and she was really seen as kind of this dynamic figure in the White House. Frances Perkins, she was appointed the Secretary of Labor. She became the first woman cabinet member. And women were appointed to other posts as well, ambassadors, judges. They were elected to office in higher numbers during the 1930s. So you did see some areas of progress. But the New Deal wasn't really, sort of designed to help women per se. And in some cases, it actually, sort of hurt women in terms of, being able to pursue careers and find employment. In terms of minorities, the New Deal was probably least effective when it came to helping African Americans and other minorities. The Great Depression hit African Americans very hard. Many were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They could not make enough selling off their cotton crop to sustain their families. African Americans working in cities were often the last hired and the first fired. More than 50% of urban African Americans were unemployed by 1933. And of course, when times are hard, racial prejudice also tends to kind of sharpen. The New Deal ended up helping African Americans survive the Depression, but it never really tried to confront the racial injustice that was built into these federal relief programs. Because so many of the programs of the New Deal were administered by the states, African Americans in the South ended up receiving smaller relief payments. The NRA codes permitted lower wages for blacks. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, as I mentioned, led to the eviction of thousands of tenant farmers and sharecroppers. They weren't covered by minimum wage. Social Security didn't cover African Americans working as farmers or domestic servants, which was a very substantial percentage of all African American workers. Despite this rather bleak record, African Americans supported Roosevelt overwhelmingly. They abandoned their historic ties to the Republican Party, and partly this is in response to Roosevelt's appointment of African Americans to some very high-ranking government positions, and also because of his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was very vocal in speaking out against racial discrimination. The head of the WPA, of course, Harry Hopkins, he had a colorblind hiring policy. So you did not have to be, there was no, restriction on who could get jobs with the WPA. It didn't matter whether you were black or white or, Hispanic, whatever. More than 1 million African Americans worked for the WPA by 1939. Overall, the New Deal provided assistance for about 40% of African Americans in the country during the Depression. And even though this was a pretty uneven record, FDR did more for African Americans than any president had since Lincoln, which was, partly why they really supported him. You also had Mexican Americans not really benefiting all that much from the New Deal. Mexican Americans were primarily engaged in agricultural labor, and so their wages fell as the agricultural sector was not doing well. There was this huge amount of unemployed migrant labor because of the Dust Bowl. You had, kind of people fleeing the flight of the so-called Okies to California. And so Mexican Americans were actually encouraged to leave the United States. Local authorities would round up, Mexican Americans and ship them back to Mexico to reduce the number of people on welfare rolls. And, in some cases, some of these people were actually American citizens. Overall, the pattern was one of economic hardship. There was very little federal assistance given to Mexican Americans as well. Native Americans fared slightly better under the New Deal. FDR appointed a guy named John Collier to serve as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And in 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, which was kind of a reversal of the Dawes Act, which we saw in the late 19th century. The Indian Reorganization Act was designed to stress tribal unity and autonomy. It was designed to give Native Americans greater control over their own affairs. Despite this, they still remained the most impoverished citizens in the country. So it didn't do too much to help them out, but they did, sort of reverse some of the acts of Congress that had been, stifling their community for a while. Really, the high point of the New Deal was in 1936, and this was an election year. Roosevelt was overwhelmingly reelected. The Democratic Party increased their numbers in Congress. But this was kind of the pinnacle. In the next couple of years, Roosevelt met with a series of defeats in Congress. Despite this, he remained a popular leader. He was facing challenges from both the left and the right in 1936. Father Coughlin and supporters of Huey Long, who had been killed in 1935, they organized a third party, what they called the Union Party. At the other kind of extreme, a group of wealthy industrialists who almost uniformly hated Roosevelt. They called him that man in the White House. They wouldn't even say his name. They formed a group called the Liberty League to fight the New Deal's assault on what they saw as their property rights. The Republicans in 1936 ran a pretty tepid campaign. The challenger was Alf Landon. He was the governor of Kansas. He was pretty moderate. He was kind of a bland figure. He refused to campaign for the repeal of New Deal reforms. During the campaign, Roosevelt attacked the Liberty League. He attacked the wealthy and the corporations, and he promised further reforms in his second term. And this was enormously successful. He won very easily. And this was really the success of that New Deal coalition that is going to dominate American politics for the next 30 years. He carries the cities very easily. He holds on to the traditionally Democratic South and the West. He adds in the very ethnically diverse northern cities. He gets strong support from labor, from African Americans. And so the poor and the kind of lower middle class, which in the Depression years included a number of formerly middle class people, they really became attached to the Democratic Party. And you see kind of the Republicans reduced to just the wealthy and kind of rural white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans. And so this New Deal coalition is very successful. And so we see this kind of, triumphing in 1936. Now, flush with his victory, FDR now turns to eliminating the last obstacle that is standing in his way, which is the Supreme Court. Roosevelt was trying to kind of ensure his legislative agenda after the Supreme Court had repeatedly invalidated parts of his New Deal by these 5-4 decisions on the grounds that they were unconstitutional. Now, FDR had passed his whole entire first term, 4 years, without the opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice. And this was virtually unprecedented. None of these justices were retiring or leaving office. And so he's increasingly getting really frustrated with this. And so he seeks a novel way to change the balance of the Supreme Court in his favor. So Roosevelt in this overwhelmingly Democratic Congress in the 1930s is facing this court that for the past 30 years had been interpreting the Constitution as espousing the idea of liberty of contract. And this was very hostile to New Deal legislation. And so FDR kind of comes to view what the court is doing by invalidating all of his, New Deal proposals as an overextension of judicial authority. The court is kind of frustrating the political and economic forces that are trying to combat the Great Depression. And so he's won this landslide in 1936, but he's facing this prospect of a hostile court. And so he's trying to kind of, figure out how he can get his legislative agenda in his second term, off the board. And this court was pretty old, pretty conservative. There were 6 justices who were over the age of 70, but none of them seemed likely to retire anytime soon. And so in his first fireside chat to the nation of his second term of his presidency, FDR kind of makes his case to the American people. He says we need to meet the unanswered challenge of 1/3 of a nation ill-nourished, ill-clad, ill-housed. And so in 1937, he proposes this kind of interesting idea. He says, we are going to, I'm proposing this scheme that's going to allow me to appoint one judge for each sitting judge over the age of 70 years and 6 months. And so basically what this would mean is that Roosevelt would now have the ability to appoint 6 more Supreme Court justices immediately. And presumably he would appoint people who had a judicial philosophy which was not hostile to his agenda. And so he wanted to increase the size of the court to 15 members. Now, since 1869, the Supreme Court justices had numbered 9. And Article 3 of the Constitution doesn't say how many justices have to serve on the Supreme Court at any given time. Instead, all it says is the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. It doesn't say how many justices have to be on that court. So what Roosevelt was trying to do was technically within the bounds of the Constitution. However, many people during and since have viewed this as an overreach of presidential power. So Republicans are, basically accusing Roosevelt of attempting to pack the court at the time. But he gets a lot of opposition, even from Democrats. They see this as Roosevelt going too far. And so he is immediately facing all this opposition in Congress. And he basically says, he backtracks. He says, okay, well, we're not going to do this eventually. So he's able to, sort of backtrack, but he ends up kind of, sort of losing this fight, and it costs him a lot of political capital. There are a lot of more conservative Democrats in Congress, and now they have, they're emboldened a little bit, and now they can oppose FDR a little bit more. So the legislative record during FDR's second term is pretty meager compared to the first. Congress does not extend the New Deal in any kind of significant areas. There is a lot of resistance to attempts at, passing things like national health insurance. Anti-lynching legislation doesn't go anywhere. There are a lot of cutbacks for relief agencies in 1936. And then in 1937, a severe slump hits the economy, and you can see that reflected here in this chart, where you have unemployment going down until 1937, when it starts to go back up again a little bit. Roosevelt gets blamed for this. It's argued that he had, his measures had attempted to push the economy too far, too fast. The problem is that Roosevelt had cut back on these government programs before the economy could handle it. And finally, in 1938, at the urging of a number of economists, Congress, Roosevelt asked Congress for relief appropriation, and the economy begins to revive. So he basically resorts to, sort of just throwing money at the economy. The result is, in 1938, the Republican Party gets kind of a resurgence. The Democrats still hold a majority in Congress, but this is deceptive because power in the House of Representatives was held by Southern Democrats, and they are increasingly starting to vote with their Republican colleagues to block social and economic reform measures. And so this is really where we start to see the New Deal coalition start to even kind of begin to decline a little bit. These traditionally conservative Democratic Southerners are beginning to move away from their more liberal rest of their party. So this kind of brings us to kind of considering the New Deal overall. What are kind of the overall achievements, and what are the limitations of the New Deal? The New Deal transforms the relationship between the federal government and its citizens. Before the 1930s, the national political debate often revolved around the question of whether the federal government should intervene in the economy. After the New Deal, it's not about whether the federal government should intervene, it's about how it should intervene. So the government is assuming responsibility and has never wholly relinquished that responsibility for guaranteeing Americans a living wage and guaranteeing protections against economic and personal misfortune. So the lasting achievements of the New Deal are this kind of, this social safety net, the Social Security, the Wagner Act establishing, sort of the relationship between labor and business. And we have this political realignment, the New Deal coalition, that endures for the next 30 years in American politics. And the Depression really causes many Americans to think about what is the real meaning of freedom here. Can you be free if you have to worry constantly about where your next meal is coming from? Can you really have liberty if you don't have the means to support your family? The New Deal is able to kind of link the idea of freedom with the expanding power of the government. It says that the government has to provide this basic safety net for people to remain free in order to pursue happiness. And FDR is very skillful at using rhetoric and the power of the media to link freedom with economic security. And he argues that this entrenched economic inequality is the enemy of freedom. It's not just the natural order of things, that the government really needs to ensure Americans' freedom by providing this safety net. Now, of course, FDR's opponents have a different definition of freedom or liberty. They argue that government spending undermines people's fiscal responsibility. They argue that new government regulations restrict freedom. So, at least in part, the New Deal is not as radical as it could have been, and it does get a lot of opposition, sort of on the right side of the political spectrum. And the limitations of the New Deal were that it did not end the Depression. The only thing that does that is World War II, as we're going to see next time. The economic system is not fundamentally altered. It's not a complete turn towards socialism. Even though some people on the right had argued that it was. It's not that. It's not a complete, kind of reorganization of the economy. And there's not very much that's done with the New Deal for those who don't have kind of political clout. The poorest Americans, minorities, women, they are not helped by the New Deal as much as they might have been. So the New Deal did have some significant limitations to it, but there are also some significant achievements as well. And as you're reading this week, you'll want to think about what are the achievements, what are the limitations of the New Deal, and what does this, how does this lay a foundation for the nation going forward? All right, so that's it for this week. I hope to see you guys in the discussion board, and we will kind of talk about it there. If you want to make some posts in the general questions forum, if you have any questions, you can kind of do that. And good luck this week.